Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 4, Episode 21. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Well, Steve, it's been a busy week, I think, for both of us, and we're heading towards our final episode, Episode 22, next week, which will be a predictions wrap-up, so looking forward to that. But in advance, we've got a great episode coming up with a very special guest back on the podcast.
Yeah, it's great to bring Ron Thurston back. He was as we'll talk about a little bit, he was a guest, I guess, early in Season 2, shortly after his book came out, and he was someone that popped on our radar screen, and since then he has been a busy guy, so...
It's so fun to catch up. We're going to learn all about his Retail in America tour. He's got this... he's got an Airsteam. He's the journey to discover everyday retail heroes. We caught up with him as he was in Memphis, but he's crisscrossing America, and it's so interesting what he's doing. And it's a really fun interview. And he's had special guests and retailers, so it's just a pile of fun. So we'll get to that in a minute or two, or 9 or 10 minutes or two. So let's talk about news of the week. So let's do a quick pop on earnings. Wasn't a particularly big week. Anything jump to mind? Anything hit your radar screen worth talking about?
Well, some of it is a continuation of themes we've touched on. If you look at the retailers that are doing well, for example, Lululemon was a significant beat this week, and the ones that are maybe disappointing a bit, I would say RH's earnings were a bit of a disappointment. I think the pattern is if you are a retailer that largely serves a more upscale consumer, you're probably not getting hit by inflation concerns very much. And if you also are a retailer that is not kind of getting caught up in this COVID rebalancing, so I think RH is being hit a little bit by people who've already bought that dining room table, that sofa, whatever. Like, there's only so many of those you're going to buy. So, but they are caught up in some of the supply chain stuff as well. But to the extent that demand for certain big ticket items, big screen TVs, the Pelotons, the washers and dryers, whatever, was pulled forward, I think you're going to continue to see some of those retailers face some pretty big headwinds. If you're in those categories where you've got that upscale consumer, people going back out, traveling, all of those kinds of things, the more luxury retailers, I think we're going to see those companies continue to perform disproportionately well. Yeah,
I mean, none of this is a surprise, I don't think, to anyone.
Yeah, I think as the quarters tick by, we'll see. I keep talking about it as this rebalancing, reversion to the mean, those sort of things. And I think the more data we get, the more that seems to be what's going on.
So breaking news, Jamie Dimon, might be a familiar name to some of the listeners, chief executive of JP Morgan, has a new job. Very exciting. He's now in the weather prediction business. He's upgraded. He's changing the forecasts. He's really grabbed onto the meme of being a weather reporter. What's the latest forecast from Jamie Dimon?
Well, he and I'm not sure exactly when he first said this because I'm lazy and I didn't go back and look, but he's been talking about there being storm clouds on the horizon. But yes, he changed his forecast to talk about a hurricane brewing, and that sent some shockwaves through the markets. I mean, certainly he's a guy that's got a ton of experience, great perspective. Also happened to go to the same college and business school as I did, so we've got that in common. He does make a few $100 million more a year than I make, but
a day, yes.
I know it's details, but I'm sure I'm happier. So that's ultimately what counts. But he sort of caveated the dire warnings with, we're not really sure whether it's kind of a Category 1 or a Superstorm Sandy. So there appears to still be some wiggle room in the degree of buckling up, buttercupping we need to do.
What else we got? So Eddie Lampert, I guess that's the Sears hometown stores are closing. I didn't even know they had still 100 Sears hometown, but I guess the Voldemort touch of death has affected those as well.
Well, yes, as I said on social media, continuing a theme that I've been on for probably 6 or 7 years now. Sears being the world's slowest liquidation sale, but everything Eddie Lampert touches seems to die. Actually, the Sears, so people may not realize this because it's a little bit inside baseball, but the Sears hometown stores, which were specialty stores focused on home products, as you might figure out from the name, they were actually spun off from the overall Sears holding company or whatever It's had different names over the years, but they were spun out and then essentially are a licensed or franchised sort of business. So they were spun out a number of years ago. So they are not part of the same corporate entity that the Sears and Kmart stores were. But so they're actually probably, in terms of locations, the last real vestige of a significant footprint. And so 100 more stores are going to close. So last one here, turn out the lights. I think we'll see very few things with the name Sears on it. I was also going to mention very quickly that it still drives me a little bit crazy. This past week when I was driving around, I heard Lowe's advertising their Craftsman Tool Days. Some folks may remember that Craftsman was an exclusive brand for Sears. That was the case way back when I worked there. And we actually looked at partnering with Lowe's or Home Depot. This is almost 20 years ago. And for reasons that are perhaps worth a separate episode, that didn't happen. But once Eddie got his hands on it and they were trying to sell things off to keep the lights on, Craftsman was in essence sold to Lowe's. So.
Yeah. And I have a connection to that. We actually have a mutual connection because they were sold, I think it was for $400 million to Stanley Black & Decker, which I work for. Yep. And made some of the Craftsman tools myself. So I still see them. Kind of like it's funny, right? No one even connects them to Sears anymore. Like the new generation, they're just a brand. Like there's not even the connection. But a couple other quick hits. I noticed, give it to the British to name their retailers appropriately. Missguided has filed for protection, and even though Boohoo was going to buy them.
Wow, this story. Yeah, we've
built to fail, I guess, or named to fail.
I think sometimes there are these rather ironically named retailers, but this is kind of part of the continuing shakeout in the pure play online, Boohoo was rumored to be perhaps purchasing them, so they've apparently taken a pass. So Missguided is going to file. Boohoo was actually one of the companies a few years ago I used to point to as an exception to my comments about the lack of profitability in e-commerce, but they have actually also fallen on harder times. So perhaps they're not in the this is your falling knife analogy. Perhaps their unstable situation wasn't going to be enhanced by catching a falling knife.
And relevant to our guest, I just saw a former, not a former guest, but a former colleague of yours, so to speak, and a previous guest on the show, Karen Katz, has got a new job over at Intermix. So that's interesting because Ron, of course, came out of the Intermix organization when it was part of the Gap. Yeah.
Yeah, I was interested to see this. Actually, two former Neiman's executives are now CEOs of smaller brands. Jim Gold now at Mode Operandi. Sorry, drawing a little bit blank there. And Karen at Intermix. It's kind of funny. Yeah, Karen, I worked with for many years at Neiman Marcus. She was briefly my boss when she was getting elevated to CEO. Yeah, Intermix back in the day at Neiman Marcus when we were working on our specialty format for younger customers called Cusp. Intermix was one of the companies we paid a lot of attention to. So certainly Karen's got a ton of relevant experience to bring to that. And then Intermix was acquired, I forget how many years ago, by the Gap, resold. So
Altamont's
a lot of shifting
Capital
concept.
Partners.
Yeah.
It's a private equity owned business.
So I think it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I think it's a solid business, but a business that's struggled a little bit to really gain a lot of traction. So that'll be interesting to watch.
Well, when you got someone who's as good as Ron Thurston running it and they don't make a go at it, you have to wonder, certainly the issue wasn't in the stores. That we can say that for sure. So speaking of Ron, let's get to our discussion with Ron Thurston live from an Airsteam trailer in parts unknown as he crisscrosses the country. Actually, I think he's in the outskirts of Memphis. So let's listen into our interview with Ron.
Well, Michael and I are excited to welcome Ron Thurston back to the podcast. He was our guest, I think, on episode 2 of season 2, and now he's just 2 away from the end of season 4. So, Ron, welcome back.
Thank you so much, Stephen Michael. It's such a pleasure to be back on the show. I feel like you have been such a supporter of my journey the last 18 months. So I'm excited to come back and give you an update.
Well, thank you for saying that. We did not know each other until about, 18 months or so ago when somehow or other we ran into your book, Retail Pride, which we can talk about a little bit in a second. But you've done quite a lot of interesting things since then. But before we get into your book and the Retail in America tour and everything else you've got going on, maybe for people who aren't familiar with you, could you just tell them a little bit about your personal and professional journey?
Yeah, of course, I'd love to. Thank you. I am someone that has spent 3+ decades working my way in stores, and the joy of that, and discovering that I was really good at the brick and mortar side of retail, was something I discovered kind of late 20s after thinking I might want to be a designer, and I realized that actually the best part of the industry is in stores. And I started at Gap Kids specifically, as an assistant store manager, sales, became a general manager, became a district manager, and spent the next decade at Gap, which for me was the foundation for a lot of what I needed to learn to grow my career into some other really exciting brands. So I was able to jump in with some former Gap leadership team and help build what is West Elm today. I helped grow and establish Tory Burch. I'm based out of the West Coast, and expand that business. I ran Apple stores. I moved to New York to launch the retail business model that is Bonobos today. I ran Saint Laurent for North and South America. And most recently, until the middle of 2021, was the vice president of stores for Intermix. And so all of that to say that this is the joy of this industry and the excitement that happens every day in stores all around the world is something I've been so thoroughly engaged with and excited about, and have, opened dozens of stores and interviewed hundreds, if not thousands of people, and traveled around the world visiting stores, and never thought for a minute that being in stores was something I wouldn't do. And being able to then write a book about it and be able to now travel and speak about it is really such a pleasure, to celebrate an industry that for, I would say really all time has not been one that has been recognized for all the hard work that goes into a career and running a brick and mortar retail business.
We had you on, as Steve said, in early in our podcast journey, and it was about the book, and we'll put a link into that interview and a link, of course, to the book. You really tapped into a vibe, like you hit. I would say you hit a nerve in all the great ways, because that book really took off for you, and it really it was so much love for the book, right? Like it was very, very emotional as you read kind of the way people responded to the book. So just give us for those who haven't read it yet, but give us a sense of what the book, where did you start with the book, and then what's the book about?
Yeah, I'd love to. Through that kind of journey that I just described, there were some very common themes, and still are today, that are very relevant to the industry. That this is an industry on the store side that maybe was not given credit, as I mentioned earlier, but there are themes around being very self-taught, that your success in this industry is often dictated by how hard you work, the leaders that you have around you, the companies you work for, the resources that they provide, that it's very often accidental, that it is not something that someone studies and says, my plan is to be a store manager, a district manager, a head of stores. There's usually some other education component or not. So those themes around an accidental career, a need to work for great companies, a need to have great mentors and people around you to move you forward, and all of that, the themes were so consistent, and recognizing the fact that I had been a leader trying to put on conferences and trying to find leadership books, trying to find things around book clubs, and what can I get for my team to help them feel great about what they do, other than me telling them that they're great. And I just came to this realization of that actually doesn't exist. It doesn't exist for the field. There are incredible books like Steve's that help us understand the industry at a more complex and higher level. But as a part-time sales sales, store managers, stock, district managers, there's never been a book written for them. And so I think that that idea of we're going to choose to take pride in a career that has not always been celebrated and may have been accidental, but I'm going to really encourage us to change this conversation to being intentional about the fact that we work in retail and providing language to them so that when someone asks them what they do, they actually have a context and an idea around how to communicate to their friends and family about their career. And that was new. I think that's why the traction of the book took off. It was written by someone that has done all of those jobs. It's written in a language that's very familiar to them. And really for the first time, it's like people said to me, this guy understands. He understands what we do every day. And thank you for giving us some inspiration to celebrate with our teams every day.
You know, even before you set out on this wonderful journey you're on, and we're going to get to that a little later in more detail, talk about the impact that the book has had. I mean, I've watched and we've watched, you're a podcaster, fellow podcaster now. I've listened to the podcast. We'll put a link into that. Just the way that people relate to you and your framework. I mean, they're so excited to talk about their careers and the journeys. Sometimes the journeys have been, they're overcoming obstacles in these journeys. But talk about the impact the book has had up to now, because it really seems, as I said, to have really tapped into something.
It really has. Thank you, Michael. I think what's struck me most is that I primarily worked for big American brands or big emerging American brands, and I had this kind of American sensibility to my perspective on retail. What has really inspired me most is that this conversation about retail pride is happening all over the world. And I get messages from India and from Asia and Latin America and Europe, and people discover the book or they'll see something on LinkedIn and then they'll buy it for their teams. And then their teams get excited and buy it as gifts for somebody else. It's like this idea of passing it on. Like there's this need to find resources and gifts to people in the industry. And when I can go to a conference and speak to a group, more specifically store managers, district managers, they're thrilled that there's someone that's speaking directly to them. And that has nothing to do with their company. It has nothing to do with whatever it is that they sell. I think of retail as so wide in its price points and business models and the variety of e-com versus brick and mortar businesses, all of it, it's so wide, but it's kind of very democratic at the same time. And I share that of like your pride in your career should never be dictated by the price. And that just because maybe you work in luxury, that you should feel more proud of the fact that I work at Dollar Tree, because working at Dollar Tree is really hard work. And you should be extremely proud of that and the work that you put into that and how you support your local communities. And when you say that to them, that's the nerve that strikes, because there's a sense of judgment when you don't work in luxury that you are not good enough to do that. And I use pride in a very intentional way. How do we remove kind of the stigma of shame of working maybe in Walmart that you should be working in Louis Vuitton? And that for me is an underlying kind of dark side of a retail career. And I very much want to change that conversation.
Well, I think there's a number of things you've done that are so impressive, but I think you actually illustrate a lot of what we talk about with this idea of being remarkable being something that is unique and memorable and very, very well done, but also, and this is really the secret sauce, I think, it's something that people talk about. So the success you've had with people sharing your ideas and recommending it to other people, I think, I'm a little jealous, but I think it's quite amazing. Now, let's talk about...
Let's talk about jealousy about this tour. Well,
I'm also jealous that I saw several pictures of Ron with Sarah Jessica Parker, so maybe we can weave that in somehow. But anyway, now you're on this tour. You've got an Airstream, and you've been traveling around to a whole bunch of cities, coming to, I think you're in Memphis now, you're coming to Texas in the next few weeks. What is this Retail in America tour? Tell us about it.
The book was launched, and the majority of all the work I did to get it off the ground happened while I was still the vice president of stores at Intermix. And the middle of 2021, kind of came to this realization of, this is big enough to create something that can impact a much larger audience, but this can't be done from my comfortable apartment in New York City. I need to get out onto the road and meet people in person, see their businesses, experience the feeling that have, to your point, Steve, like there's remarkable work happening in big cities, small towns all over this country, but they don't have the opportunity for someone to maybe see it and recognize it and celebrate it. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that in a moment. But then my husband and I said, hey, could we leave New York City? He's a designer and has had a very successful career. And could we leave New York City? Could we do this maybe we should get an Airstream, which turned into, how do you do that? And how do you buy a truck? And how do you live in campgrounds? And it took nearly a year of planning to make it happen. I've had also some very generous sponsors who love this idea. So Ubic being a big training platform, training and communication tool used by 300 brands all over the world. Spotify Advertising is very interested in how to communicate what retail pride means to an in-store experience from a music point of view. And KWI as a large POS vendor. So they jumped in and said, we'd love to help you. And that turned into what 2022 has become. So it's a minimum 20 city tour, which at this point is going to be much bigger than that, and a podcast called Retail in America, and just it's sharing stories all done live from their local cities. And here, when we're recording the podcast here in our Airstream, and this kind of feeling very familiar, very local, staying in a city, on average a week and seeing what's really happening and who do I need to meet and what conversations do I need to have. And I'll just bring a couple of examples because they're fresh in my mind. We're in Asheville, North Carolina for about 10 days, which is an incredible city. But two of the people that I met, one of which is a cycling brand called Kitspo, who has a very loyal following, but the CEO, David Billstrom, said, you know what, we're going to move all of our production to local Old Fort, North Carolina, and we're only going to produce what is ordered on our website. And in order to do that, they had to build a factory in Old Fort, and they hired about 60 local people in the community and taught them how to sew. They have an entire kind of curriculum about teaching people how to sew so that they can work in the factory and produce the product for Kitspo with no waste, no overproducing of inventory. They built a coffee shop on site. They built a retail business. They are like the hub of the local community has become this part of fashion world and sports world. And that was very enthralling for me. And also met up with the CEO of Broad River Retail, which is a large franchise of Ashley Furniture. They have stores all over the Carolinas, 32 locations. And to watch him in his own, he met me in Asheville, walked through the store, and then I had two of his team members on my podcast, which you'll hear this month. Just those stories of local communities and the impact that they have can't be replaced. And they were so proud to have someone come in and talk about retail pride and to sign books and to meet customers. Everywhere I go, I just want to do more of this because the smiles on their faces just mean everything.
And to help tell their story, right? I mean, they're doing such amazing things that you're describing, but how do you get that story out, right? You did leave out one particular session that did catch our eyes in addition to those, Ms. Sarah Jessica Parker. So how did that come about? Tell us a little bit about that. I mean, that's That's not. I don't think that happened in Tennessee. That felt like a more New York. You're back in New York again, back in Manhattan again. Talk about it for a bit.
Yes, I did. Thank you. I did go back to New York. So her footwear and accessories brand is a customer of KWI, and KWI had the opportunity to say, Sarah Jessica Parker would like to come in and meet and share about her love of retail, and have you interview her for your podcast. It's all been filmed and will be released.
Yeah,
and it was quite an experience for me. That's not something I'm used to. Kind of all the cameras and the crew and all of that.
Sure.
But it just launched this week, and the feedback's been really positive. She could not have been more lovely. And if you listen to it, what you hear is a very authentic entrepreneur, in addition to all the other, awards and impact she's had in fashion and retail in New York City and Broadway. Culture. I mean, when you listen to her describe her love of that store on 54th Street and how she's been engaged with the store and the team, that store was supposed to open right before COVID. And then, she was in there quite a bit, making sure that the customer was engaged, delivering shoes, working on the sales floor, and her love of that business is real. And it was such a pleasure for me to be able to do that.
You're like a chapter from a Dr. Seuss book. Oh, the places you'll go. Like, did you imagine these things happening as you planned out? Well, we're going to get a trailer and we're going to meet Jessica. We're going to meet Sarah Jessica Parker. Yeah. Tick. Come on, the places you'll go. Let's.
How is this not like a Bravo or Discovery Channel show?
I think it will be.
You're probably negotiating.
Come on.
I am not opposed to that, Steve. If you have some connections,
I have zero connections, but. I had a question, Ron. As a guy who's spent, it sounds like, most of his time, at least as a grown up, on the different coasts, where and even my being in Dallas, which is obviously a huge retail market, I sometimes feel that the general view of retail is so, and fashion in particular, certainly, is so driven by what goes on in New York, LA, a couple of other markets. You've been in some of those cities. I know you were in Miami, but what's your sense of the view of the world from the smaller cities, the smaller towns, compared to, kind of the fashion, the Women's Wear Daily view or the stock analyst view? Any major impressions, differences that stand out?
I think my biggest impression is that we get so caught up in that world when you work for really important fashion brands like I did, and live in New York City or LA, and that you actually think that work is really important. And you realize really quickly when you're not in those cities how unimportant it is. And that the translation of some of that to entry price points or to Target and Walmart and where most of America shops has nothing to do with any of that work. And that is, in many ways, been incredibly inspiring, is that there are much bigger things that we need to worry about than what's on trend for fall. And I have loved it. I've loved being in Walmart and watching how maybe a trend, maybe not, how most of America shops. And that is who works there and who is the customer and what is that experience, and kind of take you out of the bubble of New York, LA, Miami. And those are, trust me, it's a lot of fun. I've had the most incredible times working for those houses. But you do get caught up in that world that may not seem, or there's no knowledge of that in general America. Also, things like metaverse, no one has spoken to me once about that. Like, may not even know what it is. And
what?
I know. And so, but then you were like, but this is such every dinner party I was in New York City, that was the number one conversation. You leave New York and people are like, I don't know what you're talking about. So I think that's, this is real life here. That's an important perspective for for me to have when you think about retail, because retail is not just major cities.
Well, listen, there's an opportunity here for you. You've got the mic. You've had a lifetime of service and contribution. For the listeners out there, what a couple of things have you learned meeting people and talking to them? I mean, you're already sharing some of that perspective, but what lessons or insights a couple of insights could you share with the listeners about retail that you've learned net new to the tour? Because you've got so many insights in the book and previous conversations, but if you had, a minute to say, listen, here's what I've learned. You need to know this as a leader, no matter where you're operating as a retailer. What would that be?
So here's what I would say to answer that, Michael. I would say that there are incredible people in every city and all over this country that I've already met, and so much more ahead. But those people will require continued investment and continued training and career growth opportunities. And when someone chooses brick and mortar retail as a career, that also then puts the pressure back on brands to do the right thing. And not all the stories are positive about their experiences working in retail. And a lot of it is dictated by investments that brands make in people or lack of. And the challenges that many brands have faced the last couple of years and continue to face in a challenging hiring market does put pressure on them to do better. But I would say that that's not going to change. And if you want incredible people to continue to join your organization, continue to do good work, be really proud of what they do, that they need to be invested in. And that may be platforms like Ubic that gives them micro training every day on their phone, or big investments like Walmart just made, to recent college graduates, because Walmart recognized that we don't have enough store managers for all the stores that we're going to open. And this kind of, they're calling it this emerging coach program for young people to choose to be a store manager for Walmart at a six-figure role that can have that before they're 30. Those kinds of investments are what will keep this industry growing and expanding and being exciting and making one that people will continue to choose in a very proud way. And if you can hear that, you can hear the rain on the top of the Airstream. It's pretty hard to miss right now.
It sounds like it sounds like some birds tweeting. It's a wonderful background actually, because you're not faking. You're not faking it, man. You're on the road. I love it.
I'm on the road, and
we love it. We're gonna add rain and birds to all future podcasts, even if. Michael's got the sound effects thing, so we have not used that nearly enough.
If we can't find Ron's authenticity, we'll just make it up. We'll just fake it.
Right. We should definitely try harder to be authentic. I think that's the key advice. So, Ron, what's next for you? You're I know heading out to a bunch more cities. You want to talk a little bit about the tour, as well as anything else you've got on the radar screen?
Yeah, I'd love to. We're about 6 weeks in of the actual Airstream, so this will take us through the next several stops are Texas, then into New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, kind of up that part of the country. But the back, I would say September to the end of the year, is really from Seattle to San Diego and all down the West Coast. And there are some of the most beautiful parts of this country, of course, but there are also incredible retail businesses and people and startups and entrepreneurs that will really fuel these continued conversations for the podcast and in-store events. And everywhere I go, I just want to meet kind of the best of and have their voices heard. Using this platform, this kind of growth vehicle of Retail Pride and Retail in America to help them share how much they love working in this industry, because that inspires others to also make the same choice. And some of the best episodes or the most downloaded episodes that I've had are store managers who have been my guests, who sat here in the Airstream and shared their story about, I started in stock. I didn't ever plan to do this. And a store manager role is in my opinion, the most important role to have in retail. You set the tone for those four walls every single day. No matter what the company's doing, you set that tone. And when you hear store managers speak about leading a team of 6 or 60 or 600 in an Apple store, those are very important jobs. And I want to continue to showcase them.
So, Ron, aside from getting your book, listening to your podcast, how do you want people to engage with you when you're out on the road? Are you looking for ideas of places to visit? Do you want people to stop by? What's the best way to see what you're up to and possibly meet you and engage with you when if you happen to be in their town?
I'm pretty easy to find. I have been accused of taking over your LinkedIn feed pretty quickly. And so LinkedIn messages, on Instagram at Retail Pride, through the website at retailpride.com. I'm very easy to find. And I would love to, hear really interesting things that are happening in your city. I would love to come and say hello. I've been hosting some just retail networking events where we can bring some books and have a cocktail and have conversations about retail, potentially have you as a guest on my podcast too. So anything that seems like, hey, you know what, there are great things happening in the city. I would love for you to get involved. Please message me. It would be a pleasure.
Well, it's fantastic. What's been fantastic catching up with you. Literally, we're literally catching up with you as on your road. We often wish our guests safe travels, but that holds double for you as you continue your journey. As your words, your growth vehicle. You're growing the message, and you're doing wonderful work across the nation. So thanks, Ron, for joining us, and continued success. And we'll look forward to following. Yes, indeed, you do fill up my LinkedIn. But they're wonderful posts, so we'll look forward to continuing to follow the journey and wish you much continued success.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Steve, for having me back. And maybe we can do this again in 6 months, and I will have even more stories to share. There will be no shortage of stories about great retail in this country.
If you like what you heard, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform so you can catch up with all our great interviews, like our discussion with Target SVP Nancy King on their innovative approach to harmonize retail. New episodes will show up each and every week, and be sure and tell your friends and colleagues in the retail industry all about us.
And I'm Steve Dennis, author of the best-selling book, Remarkable Retail: How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, producer and co-host of the Conversation with Commerce Next podcast, the voice of retail podcast, keynote speaker, and host of the all-new Last Request Barbecue cooking show on YouTube. You can learn even more about me on LinkedIn or meleblanc.co. Safe travels, everyone.